David.
I'm Frank.
And I'm Alfonso.
And I'm Brad.
And we're here today in Richmond, Virginia.
Today we're starting our trek at Chimborazo Elementary School.
Once we're done here, we're going to head down to the city and talk about the Richmond Slave Trail.
Let's head on out and let's go trekking.
Let's go!
Today we're taking you along the Richmond Slave Trail. We started out at Chimborazo Elementary because they invited us to their school, and it was right up the street from our first stop along the trail, the Reconciliation Statue in downtown Richmond. From there we'll go to the Manchester Dock along the James River. That's where many slaves arrived in ships from Africa. Next we'll take you to Lumpkins Jail, where slaves were held until they were sold.
We're here in the middle of the city. You can see the large buildings around us and hear all the traffic. Behind me is the Reconciliation Statue. There are 3 identical statues in the world. One here in our city, Richmond, Virginia, another in England, and another one in West Africa. Those are the 3 main places that events in slavery took place.
The 3 places form a triangle. It begins in England, where the slave ships were launched. Here's the Reconciliation Statue in Liverpool. The ships then sailed to West Africa to pick up the slaves. This is the Reconciliation Statue in Benin, West Africa. Finally, they sailed across the Atlantic to Richmond, where we are today.
As Frank said, there are 3 of these reconciliation statues, one in England, one in Africa, and one here in Richmond. The reason why there are 3 is because the men, women, and children were taken on ships that were built from England, from Africa to the New World.
Next, we'll take you to the Manchester Docks. This is an old picture across the river from the Manchester Docks at Rocket's Landing. Most African American slaves were brought in and out of Richmond at these docks.
Here I am at the Manchester Docks, and all that's left of the docks is these rocks here, but it used to be wooden docks, and the ships would come up. Richmond was the largest exporter of slaves up until the Civil War. They exported about 10,000 slaves a month, and this trail, the slaves, after they got off the boats, they'd walk this trail up into the city of Richmond to the jail, where they would be held until they got sold.
After the slaves finally got here to the Manchester Docks, they had been on a boat for a very long time. They had to get off of the boat and walk on a trail that looked similar to this one for 3 miles until they got to the city of Richmond, so they were taken to the jail to be sold.
Once the slaves arrived in Richmond, they were taken to a jail where they waited to be sold. This is Lumpkins Jail, which was known as a Devil's Half Acre.
Here we are on this dreary, disgusting day at our final stop on the Richmond Slave Trail. Behind us is the remnants of Lumpkins Jail.
Boys and girls, there are a couple of things that we want you to notice that will help you determine that this is a primary source. First, you can actually see part of the building, part of the bricks down here at the base. This land used to be 15 feet lower in the earth. So what you also see is an outline, a rough outline of where the roof would have been on this building. This is what makes this a primary source. It's the actual bricks that were here for the building.
Lumpkins Jail was the holding place for slaves that were waiting to be sold. Once slavery was banned in Virginia and in the United States, they turned the jail and the other buildings that were in this area into classrooms for African Americans. Those classrooms turned into what is nowadays Virginia Union University, and that university is still here in Richmond.
From the jail, the slaves would be auctioned off. Here's another primary source. It's a drawing made in 1853 of a Richmond slave auction.
Slaves were mostly used to work on the plantations, but they also did other projects like build canals.
Here we are at the Canal Wall.
The canals that you see behind us were dug in the 18th century by slave labor. Now you're wondering, why do you need to build canals in a city that's right on the James? Remember, the James River, at where it meets in Richmond, is at the fall line. So ships can't go up, so they built the canals to go around all the rapids here in Richmond.
First sections of the canals here in Richmond were built by the James River Company. George Washington was the president of that company early in colonial Virginia times. The goal was to connect the canals all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, which is really far.
The canal was never completed, but Washington's goal was to connect the James River to the Canal River in West Virginia, which would then connect to the Ohio River and on into the Mississippi River.
So if you can see from this map, the canal would start at the Atlantic Ocean and run all the way west through Virginia, through its regions, and Frank's going to pick it up after that.
West Virginia, and you can still see that there's natural waterways plus some man-made canals connecting all the regions and states. So now we're in the Ohio River. We've hit Kentucky. We've got Indiana, still on the Ohio River. We hit Illinois, where we find Alfonso.
And when it was all said and done, it took numerous engineers and thousands of slaves to build the canal over a 70-year period.
We've been talking to you all about the slave trade here in Richmond, Virginia, but we were lucky enough in this podcast to have a special trekker, Allison, who went all the way to Africa just for you to show you what the slave trade was like over on the Africa side.
Hi boys and girls, my name is Allison and I'm here to help the Virginia Trekkers. I'm here today in Ghana, which is a country in Western Africa. Now I know you're probably thinking, what does Ghana have to do with Virginia? But it actually has to do a lot with Virginia's history. When the English came here, we all know that they came looking for gold, wealth, power. They were also looking for new raw materials to bring back to England. But the Africans didn't come here on their own. They were forced by the English and forced by other Europeans. These Africans had been kidnapped in their native villages and had been kidnapped by other Africans from warring villages. And they were brought from those villages to the coast where the European forts were. And there they were sold to the Europeans, where the Europeans then sold them to other countries. Now this was going on all over Western Africa. It was going on in Angola, Benin, and Ghana, just like I am here today. So what I'm standing in front of right now, boys and girls, is one of the slave castles that still remains on the West African coast. So I'm walking down a pathway at the bottom of the castle. To the left is where the women were kept in their cells. This is an example of one of the women's cells. There were 150 women kept in this cell at one time. This is where they ate, this is where they drank, this is where they stayed. It's very hot and humid in here because, as you notice, there is not much room for breathing and not much room for air, and only this one small window is what the 150 women had to breathe from. They're normally kept there for about 2 to 3 months, and after that duration, the men and the women would then meet together in front of the store. They were chained again, and they were sent through the store to the European ships. After months of being in these cells, they would only walk through these doors to be on the ships for 3 or more months, where they were packed person to person and laid in chains for the whole duration of the trip.
The trekkers would like to thank Allison for going all the way to Africa to teach us about the slave trade. But while she was there, she also wanted to share with the third graders a little bit about the Mali Empire.
Hi boys and girls, I'm Allison. I'm standing here in Africa, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the connection with the Mali Empire. Now before I start to talk about the history, I want to talk about the location where I am right now. The Mali Empire in Ghana, where I'm standing right now, is all in the western part of Africa.
Here you can see Virginia is in North America, and that's where the trekkers and you are. Ghana's over here in Africa, and that's where Allison is. And she's going to be telling you about the Mali Empire, which is right here.
This particular town that I'm standing in is called Elmina, which translates into the mine. And the mine that they're talking about specifically is the gold mine, and the gold mining that was here. Now, as you've been learning in your history class about the Mali empires, you've been learning that the Mali Empire traded gold south of them with the salt in the Saharan desert, which was north of them. Now, the salt was a very important natural resource because it helped to preserve food. And the Mali Empire, which was one of many, many great African empires, had a king that controlled the trading center. And what he would do is he would take the salt in the north and he'd trade it with the gold in the south, which is where I'm standing right now today.
Well, boys and girls, I hope you've enjoyed our Richmond Slave Trail podcast.
I'd like to thank Allison for taking us on our trip all the way over to Africa.
And if you want to see more podcasts, be sure to check out virginiatrekkers.com.
Keep on trekking.
There are 3 of these reconciliation statues. There's one in England, one in West Africa, and one here in Richmond. And they're... Hold on! There are 3 of these reconciliation statues. There's one in England, there's one in Africa, there's one here in Richmond! There are 3 of these Are you serious? Look over there.
Where is it?
It's
Oh.
right here in the parking lot. This is part of our Fix the Pothole initiative.